Today's World Insight with Wei. China and the U.S. back on the negotiating table. What are the chances of a breakthrough? And an alternative to the WTO appeals body pushed by Canada and the EU. How viable is it? Here is our host, Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing. We start with trade tensions between China and the United States. China's tech giant Huawei has released its financial report for the first half of 2019. It says the U.S. trade ban against the company has had a manageable effect on its business. Meanwhile, top U.S. trade negotiators arrived Tuesday in Shanghai to begin 2 days of talks with the Chinese side. The meeting scheduled this week will be the first face-to-face discussions between the two sides since their top leaders met at the G20 summit. Could there be a breakthrough with the talks? Take a look at this.
It's the 12th round of trade talks between China and the United States. The two-day meeting is aimed at carrying out the consensus reached by the leaders of the two countries on the sidelines of last month's G20 summit in Japan. The Chinese delegation will be headed by Vice Premier Liu He, while on the U.S. side, Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer and Secretary of the Treasury Steven Mnuchin. Chinese officials say millions of tons of American soybeans have been shipped to China after a June meeting of the two heads in Osaka, Japan. Meanwhile, the United States has also announced the exemption of additional tariffs imposed on 110 categories of Chinese industrial goods. It's been reported that China has been trying to narrow the scope of this year's talks to focus on direct trade issues. It is expected that China's import of American farm products will be on the agenda.
The Chinese market has a huge demand for American agricultural goods, such as pork, dairy products, corn, and soybeans. There's no doubt for this. We hope quality agricultural products from the U.S. can give Chinese consumers more options.
Chinese telecom giant Huawei disclosed how it did for the first half of the year, with Huawei Chairman Liang Hua announcing the Shenzhen-based company's operations are smooth and the organization is as sound as ever.
Honestly, Huawei has been somewhat disturbed by the U.S. entity list, but the overall impact is definitely controllable. Our core products weren't affected at all because our clients still trust us.
So, could the new round of trade talks be a small step of a long march, or be the light at the end of the dark tunnel?
For more on the ongoing China-U.S. trade talks, we are joined in New York by Robert Hormats, a former U.S. Undersecretary of State. He is currently the Vice Chairman of the Kissinger Associates. In Washington, D.C., Arthur Dong, a professor at Georgetown University. Meanwhile, we are also joined in Beijing studio Liu Baocheng, the Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics from University of International Business and Economics. I want to start with you, Mr. Hormats. Any breakthrough this time?
Highly unlikely. I think that the best we can hope for is that they get discussions back on track, that they provide at least a framework for moving forward, perhaps a mini deal where China buys more agricultural products and the U.S. clarifies its position on Huawei, which is still not totally clear, and they find some way of reaching at least a positive environment for moving forward, which avoids the imposition of additional tariffs or an additional confrontation between the two, which would be disruptive to the Chinese economy and disruptive to the American economy and the American stock market, which is very important to President Trump. So keeping things stable and quiet and without confrontation, I think, would be a good and likely outcome, or the most probable outcome anyway.
Professor Dong, on the other hand, how long a process of negotiation shall we expect, given the circumstances the two sides face of their own?
Yes, I would agree with Robert on this point. I believe that with this current round of trade negotiation, there'll be a lot more show than substance. I believe that the trade negotiation, this will be one of many rounds, and will continue in the months ahead.
If you take a look at the numbers that it's been having on the economies of both sides, if you look at the export numbers and the import numbers, overall trade between the world's two largest economies has been declining between China and the United States. First half 2019, China exports to the U.S. fell by 8.1%, while imports from the U.S. dropped by 29.9%. Now, Professor Liu, looking at that number as a trade expert, what does it say to you?
Well, it is very clear that the trade dispute or even trade war is really damaging to the largest economies. So therefore, the businesses are really being very jeopardized, and more importantly, that investors are really hesitating, where to put their money. And now the whole supply chain around the world is now being disrupted. So consumers, investors, and businesses, etc., they are all in a jittery situation.
Mr. Hormats, I mean, when it comes to negotiations, you are not fresh at all. You are certainly knowing all the nuances, when negotiations are going on. But now here's the thing, whether negotiation is the solution or if there's something much deeper than a trade negotiation could achieve that's taking place between China and the United States, probably that is the ultimate question that's likely to give us a hint about whether these negotiations could be successful.
Well, the negotiations are really the vehicle for doing several things. One, each side understanding the other better, for identifying areas where you can make progress in the near term, but also for understanding that there are a number of structural problems that are long-term in nature. The Chinese economy and the American economy are run very differently, and therefore there are going to be a number of areas where Chinese policy and the structure of the Chinese economy and American policy and the structure of American economy do not mesh. So part of the answer is not so much that you reach agreement on everything, but finding a framework for competition which will avoid disruption, general ground rules for competition, particularly in the high technology area, which is where a lot of the dispute is centered. And this has economic, political, and security implications for both sides. So it's not necessarily about reaching a deal today. It's about reaching some agreements now and in the next several months and years, but also a framework for interaction so these two biggest economies in the world can operate within a framework which avoids confrontation and improves chances of mutual benefit. There's going to be a lot of friction. It's a question of, can you manage it, or can you not manage it, and it reaches points of intense confrontation.
But it also has a lot to do with the intention for so-called reaching a framework, whether it is intention to really compete fairly rather, or to have one side have an upper hand in the rules of competition against the other side. That is the ultimate goal of the trade negotiation. That's a really interesting question.
It's a bit of both.
Exactly. And if not, can any agreement be reached as a result of that? That's the issue. If I could just follow up about that, Mr. Hormats, because you wrote in a recent article talking about, quote, attempting to contain China and convince other countries to do otherwise will be both unrealistic and counterproductive, end of quote. I'm not just trying to use a quote in China's favor. I'm just asking you, as a principle, when two economies are going much closer than they used to be, what would be the realistic attitude? Now, the bigger party, shall we say, the United States, at this moment still, should have in terms of trying to have a fair, quote-unquote, framework in which both sides could agree?
Well, the problem is, first of all, there's some who argue that the goal should be disengagement or separating the two economies. And I wrote in that article in the magazine called The Hill, it's really a magazine on the web, that you can't really have disengagement or separation. The two sides are too connected, and a lot of other countries are connected both to China and the U.S. for financial and economic and trade reasons. So each side clearly wants to get as much as it can out of the other. Each side really wants to have its rules and the way it does business be the accepted notion between the two countries. Each side perhaps has a different view of what fairness is. Trying to work all these things out is what is very difficult. I do think the big worry that is implicit in your question is there are some people in the United States who feel that it would be very good just to separate the U.S. From China as much as possible and maintain high barriers. Perhaps there are some people in China who have a similar view, I don't know, but I don't think in a world that's so interconnected that that is a plausible way of doing things. But I think maybe for the next several months we will not be able to reach these agreements on common rules or common practices, and there will be tariffs that will remain. But over the medium term you have to find some rules of engagement that are positive and at least provide a framework for cooperation. That's a big challenge when you have systems that are very different.
Yeah, Mr. Hormats certainly tried to be very constructive in terms of trying to let the two countries be able to come to a conclusion of something. But Professor Liu, given the fact that if you look at the entity list put out there by the Commerce Department, in which Huawei, of course, is one of those, and the recent efforts made by Washington to ask companies to apply for exemptions to the Commerce Department, hopefully within weeks and months they will be able to do that. But this is a very long process, one would argue, and therefore whether it is just a makeup or a real effort to prevent the negative effects of tariffs and entity list is a big question mark. After all, China asked for Huawei question in this round of negotiation, likely.
Well, I think it's on the U.S. side, it's a tactical situation where they can really play an upper hand because they set the rules, and they, in the end, we have the final right for interpretation of who is able to apply and who is eligible or not, etc. So this way, actually, it really sends even a longer list of uncertainties that many other companies are really facing because, how they can really have a dialogue that prior to the approval or application process, and how can what are those criteria that they will be able to hold on, in order to play a fair and transparent one. So it's a black box that is being played, in the upper hand. But in the end, I think it's also going to hurt the U.S. interest.
Well, certainly the companies are complaining. That's why they have to have this exemption rules. But whether these exemption rules are just makeup or likely really it's going to help those American companies dealing with Chinese tech companies is another thing. Going to you, Professor Dong, about that. Now, Huawei put out the financial report for the first half of this year, certainly quite good. If you look at the numbers, 301.4 billion. However, as the trade war drags on, it's going to be a big, heavy burden for tech companies around the world because they have to deal with not only the current financial reports for the year, but also the possibility, what if there were two systems, one in China and one in the United States?
Yes, I would. Looking at Huawei's most recently released financial performance, it certainly demonstrates Huawei's remarkable resilience in the face of such strong, political opposition here in the United States, and certainly the impact of the embargo on parts. What I would suggest is that Huawei is not out of the woods, and I think they fully realize that perhaps things are going to get worse before they get better. It's pretty well known that Huawei had stockpiled a large amount of inventory in anticipation of the embargo on those critical parts. And now with various American vendors and suppliers having to apply for waivers, it's not just that they'll be able to sort of overcome the waiver and get a waiver from Commerce Department, but now there's also going to be additional review through the Department of Defense. And so I think some of the more generic parts that can be easily sourced from other countries will probably get a waiver, but perhaps some of the most critical aspects, such as the more high technology chips and microchips that go into Huawei products, I would suggest that there's going to be some greater sort of a greater length of time before those parts are released. So I think Huawei, I think they're quite concerned about the, you know, let's talk about the 6-month to the 8-month to 10-month road ahead.
Now, if you look at other issues, Professor Dong, I want to continue a little bit about that. Apple has decided to move the Mac Pro production line, the only one it has in the United States, to China. Of course, it's not just about standing in which line, but rather it's about reducing the cost of the whole production. It's very clear from a company's perspective. Meanwhile, you see Elon Musk trying to establish some kind of a joint venture with the Chinese side, or by putting out a company and factory in Shanghai. Now, it really gives people some hint about whether tech companies, big ones around the world, are thinking about different options. And when they think about different options, what would this mean to them when it comes to costs and other issues related to the management? Professor Dong.
Yeah, I think, well, certainly much to the consternation of President Trump, you know, Apple's decision to locate some further production of their MacBook to China certainly is not, you know, gaining a lot of favor for Apple in the White House. But when companies examine the choices that they have with regard to global supply chain, global sourcing, and certainly global manufacturing, there's certainly no shortage of cheap labor around the world. And as we know and have observed over the last 10 years, the rise of labor costs in China have been significant. And Apple can certainly go to countries like Mexico, which are a lot closer. And actually, when you look at the fully loaded and burdened labor cost of Mexico, it's very competitive to China. But what Apple is finding and what other manufacturers are finding, it's the quality of labor. So when they say, okay, we'll observe a Chinese worker can produce 10 iPhones an hour, whereas the same worker in Mexico can only produce 5. So it's these inherent efficiencies that are, it's not only about the cost of labor, but it's about the quality of labor.
Right.
And on that basis, many American companies are finding China to have a great sort of substantial advantages in that regard.
Got it. The other thing, of course, is about the agricultural products purchase. Of course, it's good for the election in Washington, but the question really is, Professor Liu, does China really want to do that? And to what extent China will do that based on the result or none of the results, if there's no result in the negotiation coming up this week, for example?
Well, definitely the U.S. enjoyed comparative advantage merely in terms of the cost and the quality, in terms of agricultural produce, but now this situation is really being politicized along both sides. So therefore, policymakers do not really only calculate the cost; they calculate also the political cost involved. So therefore, you know, retaliation will have to be in place if the U.S. does not really you know, remove certain of the unfair demands in Chinese perspective. So therefore, China is there to defend its principle at a certain cost. And also, we notice that all Chinese business interest groups and consumers are now getting emotionally prepared to support the Chinese government to fight this war in retaliation.
Mr. Hormats, as you may know, the Chinese market have been looking for alternatives when it comes to purchasing agricultural products. Now, when the U.S. and China are having trade war, China already find several places for its agricultural imports. Now it's working pretty well so far. What do you make of the chances that the American farmers will be able to once again come back to the Chinese market? On what timetable will that interact well with the election season?
Well, I think that there are a couple of issues. One, you can get almost all the products that the U.S. produces somewhere else. The difficulty in one circumstance is that it may take more time to get to the Chinese market than it would if you ship from the west coast of the United States, which is where American agricultural products are shipped out of. But the broader question is one that you have really pointed out, and that is the question of reliability. One of the problems with interrupting these supply chains is the question of, can, in the future, Chinese importers rely on the United States to be a steady stream supplier, or will there be future interruptions, future disruptions? And this is one of the same issues that the American high-tech companies have to deal with, and that is with the ZTE issue and now the Huawei issue and these permits that are required. Is the U.S., which does have very high quality computer chips and a whole range of other things, is it going to be seen by Chinese, who do depend on this very heavily now, is it going to be seen as a supplier that will be reliable? The quality will be there, but will the reliability be there? This is what happens when you use light switch tactics to turn supply chains and purchasing chains on and off. And I'd like to just make one point in addition to what Professor Dong just mentioned. American companies supply in China or buy things from China or produce in China in part because of high quality labor, but also China has a great infrastructure and turns out a lot of engineers and scientists and others which other countries really don't have in such abundance and quality. So you can have the fundamentals that are very good, but if governments now or if circumstances cause supply chains to be interrupted, unfortunately it's disruptive to companies, it raises their costs, and if they can't predict, it's very hard for them to make investment decisions. And this is what we're seeing on both sides of the Pacific.
Right. Before we go, I do have a final question, but I think it's also very crucial. I mean, from the Chinese side, it would like to have the tariffs added by Washington over the past year of trade war being reduced and take off, of course. For the U.S. side, the issue of intellectual property rights is a very crucial one. Now, for the tariffs, it's easy to see whether it's still there or not. For the intellectual property rights issue, it seems to be more flexible, or in other words, it's hard from people from outside to judge whether the result is the most satisfying or not, quote unquote. So how should we see the concerns from both sides in this round and the following up rounds, if there are any? Professor Dong.
Yes, with regard to intellectual property, I think, as you said, it is a much more intangible sort of results that can be demonstrated on behalf of China. But I think if China makes steps structurally, in other words, start to put in place procedural aspects to reinforce and to protect intellectual property rights, start creating frameworks around procedure and process, I think that'll go a long way towards assuaging American concerns with regard to China's approach to the protection of intellectual property.
I see. And Professor Liu, final words on that too?
Yeah, so the trade tariff or government subsidies and even the performance of the state-owned enterprises, they can be quantified. But in the meantime, the intellectual property rights issue really takes time. So I do agree with Professor Dong, as long as there is a sort of convincing and enforceable procedure that is set in place, I think that can also be more acceptable. So it's really the level of sincerity and the level of enforceability that the U.S. is really concerned.
We're looking forward to hearing results from this round of discussion between the negotiators of both sides. For now, I want to thank the three of you helping us to understand the latest. Robert Hormats, Arthur Dong, Liu Baozheng. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much, gentlemen. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our live program. An alternative to the WTO appeals body pushed by Canada and the EU. How viable is it? We'll ask our panelists right after this break. The world's top trade court, the WTO appellate body, has been rendered ineffective after the U.S. campaign to block the appointment of new judges. Last week, Canada and the EU tried to come up with their solutions, agreed on an interim alternative to stop their trade disputes from falling into limbo. Could the Canada-EU interim alternative work? That is the question. But first, take a look at this.
U.S. President Donald Trump opened another chapter in a trade war with China, but this time its crosshairs also on the WTO. Last Friday, the U.S. put pressure on the WTO to change how it designates developing countries. Mr. Trump sought to redefine the status of developing countries. On Tuesday, China fired back. The classification of a developing nation shouldn't be defined by the interests of the U.S.
WTO is not owned or dominated by one or a few countries, but should respect the common will of all members.
Coming on the eve of a new round of U.S.-China trade talks, the move many believe appears aimed at pressuring Beijing to commit to more purchases of American goods. Besides China, Mr. Trump went after the WTO 7-member appellate body. The U.S. has rendered the world's top trade court practically ineffective. As Trump blocked nominations of new judges, the court will be unable to hear appeals in trade disputes after December this year. Several WTO members have tabled proposals. Recently, Canada and the EU agreed to a new trade dispute resolution system as a temporary substitute to the WTO's appellate body. Such agreement is widely seen as vital to tackling trade protectionism.
After this summit, we're closer to finalizing an agreement, which would help preserve the function of an appeal system within the WTO until we find a more permanent solution.
Could the interim appeals body succeed where the WTO appellate court has stumbled? Would the idea catch on?
So, could Canada-EU interim alternative to the WTO appellate court work? To what extent will it work? Let's loop in our panelists. In Toronto, Canada, we have Aurel Brown, a professor of international relations and political science at the University of Toronto. In London, we invited Ian Beck, professor at the European Institute and co-director of the Darendorf Forum London School of Economics and Political Science. In Beijing, Liu Baocheng from the University of International Business and Economics. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Professor Brown, go to you first. How long do the Canadians believe this alternative would work?
Well, certainly there's hope that it would work, but I think this hope may be exaggerated. This is something temporary, and it does not apply to relations between the United States and Canada. This solution would be something that would be applicable to relations between the EU and Canada. The EU certainly is a very major trading partner of Canada. It is important in investments, but it pales in comparison with the United States. The United States is by far the largest trading partner and investor in Canada, and consequently, it's not going to resolve the kind of issues that we have over softwood lumber and other problems between Canada and the U.S.
So here is the thing, Professor Beck. You know it very well. WTO appellate body, 7 members. Now you only have 3 members left in the body, and 2 of the 3, their term will expire in December, which means you only have 1 person left in the appellate body. Of course, it's going to be irrelevant beginning from next year. U.S. refused to come to any conclusion of confirming any future judges. Now, Professor Beck, what can we do? Is Canada-EU way the best way?
Well, I think you need to take one step back first and point out that arbitration is a necessary feature of a rules-based system. If you can't arbitrate and make appeals and judgments at the end of it, then the system as a whole is weakened. And that was precisely the reason that the World Trade Organization was set up with this new judicialized body, the appellate body, designed to make a final decision on disputes. Now, what the Canadians and the Europeans have done is to suggest an alternative way of doing this, which applies only to the two of them. There are 160 other members of the World Trade Organization, and they are not going to be subject to this new initiative. It may pave the way for a different approach to settling appeals, but only if you can get the other major players, particularly China and the US, to sign up to it, and we're a long way from that.
Professor Liu, now, we all understand WTO, the reason why it's called World Trade Organization, and this rule is different from the earlier body called the GATT, is because WTO has the T's. The T's is exactly referring to the appellate body, which is going to deal with disputes, as mentioned by the earlier two professors. Now, Professor Liu, it does not anymore, given the current circumstances. Will other countries follow suit to try to establish bilateral deals like what Canada and EU have been doing this time with the interim alternative? Or there are other ways they can try to figure out some solutions? At least trade disputes has to be resolved, even next year.
Yeah, that's the strength of WTO, to have the DSP, or dispute settlement body, in place to adjudicate cases when there's a disagreement. And so right now, when it's the appellate court is being jeopardized with the U.S. blockade, so there can be certain solutions. One is, of course, Canada and EU actually raised a very symbolic gesture. So okay, so we still follow WTO rules, and we do it on a bilateral basis or a trilateral basis. So that can really serve as one option. I think even if when WTO is really normalized, because there's still a high level of backlog in place, so therefore that can be a solution. And the other is, okay, if the U.S. continues or permanently with, hold on the decision to nominate the judges, can WTO Secretariat call on the WTO other members and say, okay, let's elect some other juries onto the board.
I see.
And the other is, okay, if the DSP decide, okay, we can really delegate to certain well-known arbitration bodies that are available around the world.
Very interesting.
So that can also be one alternative.
A lot of the intellectual approach, I would say, Professor Brown, but the question is, does the world, without the United States, be able to function? That is the question I would like to ask you, especially when it comes to trade. And also, will others have the confidence and the guts to do so?
Well, of course, this is the fundamental question. Can you build something? Can you have some kind of arbitration mechanism without the United States? And there are, in some quarters, the assumption that this is a problem that pertains particularly to the Trump administration, which has challenged many of the institutions in the international system. But the reality is that the United States as a whole has been unhappy about some of the proceedings for quite some time now. Let us not forget that, let's say in the case of one of the judges, Jennifer Hillman, she was blocked from reappointment not by the Trump administration, but by the Obama administration. And there's no assurance that, let's say, if Mr. Trump loses the election, a new government of the United States would take a necessarily dramatically different approach. So, in a sense, there are these very basic structural questions and procedural questions that need to be addressed, because when you have a superpower like the United States that has been unhappy and opposed to how decisions are made for quite some time now, then whether we like it or not, we have to address those issues.
Professor Liu, now, when it comes to the United States, the U.S. administration this time have been asking whether the developing country status of both China and some of the others should be scrubbed off. And as a result of that, the overall change the picture of the WTO situation. Professor Liu, of course China is against that, but the question really is, what's next, right? When you have strong economies in the world, emerging economies that are really not in line with the largest economy in the world, are we going to see more and more battlegrounds within the WTO framework, Professor?
Definitely, it's inevitable. The U.S. is really trying to unravel the entire table and set up new rules, but they forget the fact that there are over 160 members, and the whole essence of WTO, or the spirit of WTO, is really inclusiveness, and major decisions are really based on consensus. So otherwise, it's the U.S. club. Everyone else has to rejoin. So therefore, with this type of attitude, and also with the gestures such as blocking the jury, etc. So definitely they're going to offend many other members. So and plus that 2/3 of the countries within the WTO framework are really, by definition, developing countries.
Right.
So if you totally ignore this fact, then it's going to be impasse, and other members will have to find alternative way of getting engaged.
When you talk about other members, certainly these are very interesting alternatives that they are trying to figure out. But on the other hand, Professor Begg, if you think in the shoes of the Trump administration, which could be a little bit challenging for you, but anyway, on the one hand, they could say, okay, WTO has become irrelevant, so let's not to deal with it. On the other hand, it could force some of the other countries, whether emerging or developing economies, or some of the other trading partners of the United States for decades, to do something that they do not like in the names of protecting WTO. So for the Trump administration, there seems to be no lose game anyway.
Yes, and I think that's the way the administration sees it, as they want to recast the rules of the global trading system to be much more in favor of the United States. It's also perhaps significant that if you look at the increase in the number of disputes that's going on, I've checked the WTO website on this, you see that far more of the current disputes do concern the United States. So they need for themselves ultimately to have a system that enables them to settle disputes. Otherwise they're going to find their own difficulties in some of the things they're trying to do. But what's been very clear
But they can just walk away
is
from the
that
disputes and say, I'm not going to be responsible for any of the things that you have been raised against me.
Yes, they can, but then they want to export as well. And if they're blocked in exporting, there are one or two big American companies that are going to be terribly upset with this, with names like Boeing and Microsoft. They will want to ensure that there is a system in place that they can deal with successfully. So maybe there's a need for an overall recasting of the approach to governing world trade, but that has to include some revised form of dispute settlement.
I see. Professor Brown, so what is the solution after a long discussion, to you at least?
Well, it has to be through some kind of cooperation. Yes, United States does have an interest. It's a very large trading nation, but it is not quite as dependent on trade as some other countries are. And I think there has been a good deal of unhappiness in the United States. There are issues elsewhere as well. So I think a cooperative approach would help. But what is happening right now may not be necessarily the best way. One might argue that it is just that Canada and the EU would try something different, an alternative, something temporary. But if this creates more friction between the United States and Canada, that will not necessarily be helpful. So there's a difference between that which may be just and that which may be wise strategically.
Right. Before we go, I also want to ask the other two gentlemen very briefly, if you can. There seems to be two issues. One is your national interest, which of course also has something to do with the international rules. But on the other hand, there's a bigger thing, which is about how the international system should be running. Would there be one veto coming from the U.S., the others have to say, okay, well, we could just do whatever you want. So Professor Begg, here's a very interesting question, isn't it? Briefly from you, sir.
Well, yes, the Americans have shown in the last couple of years especially that they're prepared to be the big kid in the playground, bullying the other kids. And I think that the danger with that is that then the other kids start to gang up against the United States in a way which becomes counterproductive for everybody. We shouldn't forget the 1930s, when these kinds of trade wars led to all kinds of negative consequences, not just for the economy, but what with wider political ramifications. So let's remember history in this and say, let's find a way through this. And that's what I've been trying to put forward in some ideas I've been publishing.
When you want to find a way, will others also want to find a way, or the other want to find a way? Professor Liu, briefly.
Well, I think the U.S. is really trying to, bully the rest of the other countries while they still maintain strength in military, in finance, and also in trade, etc. But this gesture will mean that they will lose more of the collaborative structure and also the support from other neighbors and the rest of the WTO members. So this is really self-jeopardizing. So this can also push more for the rest of the global community to rally together for their own solution.
Very interesting. Certainly, the three of you have different solutions, different concerns, but absolutely this discussion is going to continue. Liu Baocheng, Ian Beck, Laurel Brown. Thank you so much, the three gentlemen. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight, CGTN, into your search engine. Check out our YouTube channel also. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for more insights across China and around the world. Good night.